Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, and welcome to Prog Chattery 777. So for this video, I thought I would talk about my top 3 favorite musical artists ever. Should be quite interesting because I should say, in principle, I'm not really one for categorizing music or art into lists of, top 10 best whatever of all time, top 10 best albums, top 10 best songs. I'm really not for that because music, of course, is all about taste, and tastes change. So, if I'm talking about, the best album of all time or whatever I would have thought the best album of all time was when I was 18 is bound to be something different from what I would say now. So, in general, I avoid listing things because, it's a redundant exercise, I guess. But throughout my musical, life, my musical journey, whatever you want to call it, as a musician and as a fan of music, there have been 3 artists that have always been there that sort of, to me represent the very best that music as an art form has to offer. Now, obviously, music is a very, very large thing, and it's made up of many broad terms and definitions, and, it's why it's a useless exercise to try to do these lists. But these 3 artists, I think, like I said, they encapsulate the best that music has to offer. So if I were to divide, what I appreciate and what I enjoy about music into 3 main categories, that may help explain why these 3 artists have always been there. So the first category, I would say, is composition. Composition is obviously very, very important, and in my mind, it's a process of organizing different things. And if I'm listening to a piece of music, I'm always, listening for what is interesting about this composition. Is there anything there that, is it complex? Is it simple? Is it? I like to figure out the architecture of a piece, and how all the pieces of the puzzle fit together. That's an intriguing thing, and that doesn't necessarily, that's not talking in reference to, songwriting or anything like this. It's, strictly how well does a composer know his or her musical language. So that's the first factor, is the composition interesting? Is it sound? Is it, does it intrigue? Does it delight? Does it offend? So composition's a big thing. That's the first musical factor that goes into this list, this little top 3 list. The second musical factor is, it's kind of, I touched about this in my history of progressive rock video, but the sense of adventure. Does the music, seek to, challenge any preconceived ideas about whatever form it's trying to take on? Is the music exploratory? Is it risk-taking? Is an artist, risking his audience for some weird new idea? So I like the idea of artists that push forward with incredibly original ideas, and I like that fearlessness. So that's the second musical factor. The third musical factor for me is the songwriting factor. Now that's, loosely related to the composition thing, but with songwriting, it's more to do with, chords, melodies, and lyrics. How well does a set of lyrics sit above, a certain chord structure or chord progression? And does the melody fit the lyrics? And do the chords, support the lyrics? If there's an instrumental section in the song, does it does it serve the song? Does it serve the idea that the lyrics are trying to convey? Which is a different thing from composition, unto itself. Composition is, a strictly musical thing. Songwriting, there's a myriad of different factors that go into that, whether it be, poetic or, otherwise. So those are the 3 things that I look for the most when I'm, getting into a band or whatever. And now, without any further ado, I've been talking for a while, I'll talk about the actual artists that I think are the best in each of those 3 mediums. So if we're talking of composition, I must say it goes to Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa was an immensely talented man and an immensely smart man. He was incredibly musically literate, perhaps more so than anybody else. He's incredibly prolific too. You look at the sheer amount of material that Zappa had, written and, released in his time, plus all the posthumous stuff that's come out since he's passed. It really is unbelievable. but you know, his composition and his understanding of music is just, it goes unsurpassed. And the way that he was able to you know, take so many disparate musical styles and put it together, you know, let's make doo-wop songs with classical melodies, or you know, how can we make something that's got some reggae in it with some jazz, with some you know, rock, with some social satire. You know, he really was, you know, um, an archetype of the 20th century in terms of music, and his compositions are utterly fantastic. You know, there's nothing more distinctive than Frank Zappa's sense of melody, and you know, it is just a whole other world of expression, and his mastery and understanding of composition and of the form and how to get the best out of a piece of music using just dots on paper never ceases to amaze me. Frank is you know, he's always been one of my favorite musical people and always will be. He is one of my idols, certainly. So then, if we move on to the next factor, which is that fearlessness, you know, sense of adventure, don't want to say progressive, but that whatever that is, it has to go to King Crimson for me. King Crimson is an immensely amazing band, and I've been a big fan since I was a kid, and my appreciation and understanding of the band has only grown. And you know what? There's a muse to King Crimson that it's very difficult to put your finger on, actually. You know, when it comes, you know, for me to say, you know, what are the reasons, why do I love King Crimson? You know, it's kind of difficult to pin it down to one thing, because, you know, throughout their career and all the different lineups and versions of King Crimson that have, you know, existed, you know, they've just covered so much ground. You know, there's no one thing that makes them great. You know, whether it be, you know, the big heavy riffs that they do, or like the gamelan things that they did in the 80s, or, you know, the percussion. The drums are a huge factor in King Crimson, and always have been, right the way through to the very first album up to the current lineup with the 3 drummers, which is immensely awesome. I've seen them twice now, and it was some of the very best performances I've ever seen ever. Yeah, King Crimson is there's an inexplicable intrigue and muse to the band that is just, you know, it's terrifying at times. You know, there's, you know, a song like Level 5 from The Power to Believe. You know, witnessing that live by an 8-headed beast of a band, you know, the hairs stayed up on the back of my head for a couple of days after that. It's just phenomenal. Obviously King Crimson is very much a live band too, and I mean, people might be wondering, why haven't you talked about King Crimson? That's one of my most requested bands, and I'm kind of scared to, because I want to talk about King Crimson correctly, but that's a very difficult thing to do, because what do? Go through all the albums and talk about the albums? Well, I'm only scratching the surface of what makes King Crimson so awesome, because it's the live performances that drive the magic of King Crimson, more so than the live albums. You know, as Robert Fripp says, you know, a hot date is a live performance, and a studio album is a love letter. And there's a lot of truth to that, especially with a band like King Crimson. So the second factor, you know, fearlessness, adventure, and the way that King Crimson reinvents itself every time it comes back is another big factor. So the fearlessness and the sense of, you know, adventure, King Crimson wins that title for me. Excuse me. And finally, the third big factor for music, the songwriting factor. No, you know, a lot of artists, especially in popular music, must be, you know, named. Everyone, when people talk about songwriting, they always talk about the Beatles. Now, I'm not the, you know, I'm not saying I'm not a fan of the Beatles. I recognize their importance. I've played lots of Beatles songs as a musician. I know I've played almost all of them. And the thing that always comes back to me is that, wow, the quality of the band is just immensely good. But I've never been a huge obsessive fan of the Beatles. I wouldn't be able to do my long-winded video series on the albums by the Beatles, because I've never invested that much time into it. So it's not the Beatles. The songwriting factor does not go to the Beatles for me. Just wanted to get that out of the way. So if you're upset, I'm sorry. There's other artists like Bob Dylan and da-da-da-da. But for me, the best songwriting that's touched me in my life and and meshes with my taste is Peter Hammill. The music of Peter Hammill is just unbelievable. It's one of those difficult things to talk about. He is an absolute master of, you know, melody, lyrics, and expression. I mean, there's so much that goes into Hamel's music that makes it what it is. I mean, for one, he is certainly one of the most brilliant lyricists in, in music. That's a taste thing. I'm not saying he's the best lyricist, it's redundant to say those things, but in my musical universe, it's pretty tough to beat Hamel's words. It's the delivery of those lyrics. I mean, he can be incredibly, delicate and beautiful in his delivery with, very, lush melodic phrases, but he can also scream and rant and, and his voice is astounding, really. And it's like I was saying, the great thing about a songwriter, or that factor of music, is how well does the music translate the lyrics? Do the melodies and do the chords and does that deliver the message behind the lyrics? And Hamel does that beyond, unlike any other. And it's a lot of that has to do with his voice, but a lot of it has to do with just great songwriting as well. And obviously, if I'm talking about Peter Hamel's songs, that includes Van der Graaf Generator as well, because of course Peter Hamel did write the majority of all the Van der Graaf stuff. So, and with Van der Graaf, it's, even though they're a prog band, there's that nasty word again. They had the long extended songs and whatnot, but it's not like Yes or Genesis, or I shouldn't say Genesis. There is a similarity with Genesis. Not a similarity. I'm not saying there's a, I'm not saying Genesis sound like Van der Graaf Generator. The similarity is the fact that they're focused on songwriting, Yes and Genesis are different because Yes just, let's put a million different ideas in one song and then the song's 20 minutes. Genesis still wrote songs, and Van der Graaf Generator wrote songs. But they're immensely different. I think Van der Graaf's much better than Genesis, in my opinion. I was going in a different direction there, but I am afraid I totally lost it. I think I was just talking about how, even though the songs are very long, it's not about the playing, it's not about the, it is about the composition, but it's a different thing. It's still focused on verses and songs, and it's just his lyrics just got longer and longer and longer, so the songs had to get bigger and bigger and bigger. But yeah, Peter Hamel to me is one of the greatest songwriters of recent times for sure, and he's another one of those ridiculously prolific songwriters as well. He's made so many albums. His most recent album, From the Trees, was released just earlier this week, actually. From the time that I'm recording this video, I'm not sure I'm going to release it yet. And I'm eventually going to do a chat about From the Trees, but I think I'm going to talk about all of the Peter Hamel albums on this channel. That's going to be sometime in 2018, so stay tuned for that. And I might get to doing some Crimson videos as well. But yeah, there you have it. As usual, I've descended into a completely incoherent, rambling mess. But there you go, my top 3 favorite musical artists, in no particular order, I should point out. Frank Zappa, King Crimson, and Peter Hamel / Van der Graaf Generator. So there you have it. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed my near incoherent ramblings. And until the next video, whatever it may be, you will see me in the future. Thank you very much, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and all the rest of it. Bye-bye.